Everyone, independently of the team they sit in, their core competency, or the practice they belong to, is actually a product owner. It doesn't matter to me if you're a technical account manager, a sales engineer, a developer, or part of a delivery group. I equate it to being a stakeholder, and as a stakeholder, I have a vested interest in the success of the product because I really genuinely want it to be a value add and do well. There are obviously some organizational constraints and guardrails that govern and dictate corporate shape and structure, and those tend to vary business to business in my experience. But that aside, my experience has been most rewarding and positive on teams where there is either an implicit sense of product ownership or it's somehow codified into the team's mission. Either way, it helps create a sense of common purpose and it reinforces this idea of stakeholdership. Central to this idea of product-centric ownership and being run by ideas is having a vibrant, focused, short, and honest feedback loop. Communication is key. That said, the value a product or service delivers can be both qualitative and quantitative, and so can be a tad subjective and open to interpretation. You can even argue there are different types of value. And so the reality is that product development, like almost everything else, comes with trade-offs and a certain degree of risk. There is business risk in that you don't necessarily know if you're building the right thing to begin with. There is technical risk in that you can't be sure you've assembled the right team with the right skill set to build the thing itself. There may be some unknowns as well around the technology backbone underpinning the solution in terms of its extensibility or its ability to scale and more. And obviously there is financial risk in that you often can't definitively guarantee, no matter what anyone says, that you'll wrap up on time and within budget. At first, there is a bit of uncertainty, but over time, and because of the great feedback loop you've worked so hard to establish and nurture, that uncertainty gradually goes away, and you have some breathing room to start focusing more on customer value. You know what you're going to build and how, and so the value curve trends like this. It sort of meanders in its infancy, then steepens. The curve gradually flattens out as you build out and introduce core functionality and release the highest value stories, features, and functions first. That flattening makes sense because as the product evolves and matures, your focus pivots away from building out core functionality towards improving existing functionality and invest in stabilization and capacity. Basically, you're no longer making exponential leaps, you've transitioned into a phase of incrementality. There are many other trade-offs, of course, but one of the hardest to balance is short-term and long-term focus. It's sometimes inherently challenging to know what to do next. Should you focus on urgent hot fixes that are preventing further adoption of the application, or develop some shiny new widget to make the application more attractive, user-friendly, intuitive? Or should you focus on something more systemic that will pay dividends down the road, but not immediately instead? And so there's this inherent tension between both because both are valuable in their own right. I think of it as short-term reactivism versus long-term proactivism. Focus also becomes a trade-off in a different yet related way depending on the profile of the team. Product folks tend to want to focus on building the right thing, engineers focus on building the thing right, and the business tends to want to have things built fast. In an ideal world, you'll find the perfect balance between all three, but that's rare and hardly ever happens. You'll likely be faced with one of three scenarios instead. You'll either spend too much time thinking about the right thing to build and devoting tons of resources to building it right and perfecting it before going to market, that you either miss the market window and fail to capitalize on the opportunity altogether, or you run into liquidity problems when your cash flow dries up. Either way, you're in a bad spot. Don't wait for the perfect moment, choose a moment and make it work instead. Another potential scenario is you end up rushing beta and go to market with something you haven't fully vetted, thought through, nor regression tested. You may capitalize on and benefit from this short term, but as bugs become obvious and the user experience becomes unmanageable, you'll pay the price for this long term. A little less likely, but still possible, is delivering something incredibly well architected in record time, but if it doesn't address the real need and there is no real demand for it, all the effort is for naught. Okay, let's talk feedback loop. On the one hand, there is the product lead or owner. He or she is responsible for understanding what's being built, why it's being built, and for who it's being built. This is the person with the vision. On the other hand, there is a mixed group of stakeholders who will have input into the development of the system in the form of feedback. These folks can be internal resources that sit outside of the product group, but have some sort of tie back to the product itself. Folks like technical account managers, sales engineers, customer success managers, and even delivery support folks like solutions architects and BSAs. Or they can be external stakeholders who will use the application somehow or will be otherwise affected by its development and release. In the context of B2B enterprise SaaS, these are typically clients. All these stakeholders will have ideas and provide feedback, commonly referred to as stories. At a very fundamental level, the product lead's goal is that these power users grow to love the application. Finally, there is the development team responsible for actually building out the system. If at all agile, they push code often and work through a certain number of stories per unit of time, whatever that number is. Balancing this team's capacity is tricky because, on paper at least, the stakeholder group will have more ideas and feedback than the development team can actually work through. This creates a funnel-shaped backlog because of capacity constraints. The development team can realistically accept something new to work on, a new story, only after they've delivered one. A backlog buildup can create stress or can lead to cutting corners to increase output at the expense of quality. It also means that you may be delivering functionality to stakeholders 6 to 12 months after the fact, with a very real chance you've missed a market window. Not a place you want to be in. So the product owner is responsible for narrowing down focus and making key decisions around what stories get accepted based on their potential, their criticality, and their value. Communication across the feedback loop is key to make sure the collective is focusing on the most valuable things only, while simultaneously removing some of the noise that comes with story overload. Not every story is the same. Some are large and require a lot of effort, some are small and require little effort. It's a little counterintuitive, but story size doesn't necessarily correlate to value. There are large effort stories that come with little value and small scale stories that are very valuable. So the product owner taps into story value and size relative to one another to narrow down focus and prioritize the queue. Small effort, high value stories get prioritized. This also works as a tiebreaker. If two stories have the same relative value, but one is big and complex while the other is small and simple, priority is given to the smaller, easier story. And at least initially, value assignment is relative and a tad subjective. But over time, as the team collectively works through more and more stories and has more development hours under its belt, if the feedback loop is open, honest, transparent, and short, narrowing down focus based on value and potential becomes second nature and a lot less of a guessing game. I'll wrap up with this. The goal of this interconnected system should never really be how much output it produces. It's not about numbers or units. It's about reaching desired outcomes, which in this case is delivering things stakeholders, both internal and external, love and evangelize.